Tonight on Nation to Nation, we sit down with Senator Murray Sinclair in a wide-ranging interview, including his impact in the Senate.
And I'm not one to shy away from opportunities to remind them when they say and do things that ignore the rights of Indigenous people.
Sinclair is most known for being chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but he has a warning for society if it keeps ignoring Indigenous people.
We will likely be creating a population of young Indigenous people who will be prone to thinking about acting out violently against society.
Hello, I'm Todd Lamoran, and welcome to Nation. Those are strong words from Senator Sinclair. And earlier this week, I got a chance to sit down and talk with him, where he had a lot more to say. Everything from growing up just north of Winnipeg to chairing the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry to the TRC. Here now is the whole interview. Senator Sinclair, welcome to Nation, and thank you for talking to me.
Well, thank you for having me.
We're going to start with you're born on the former St. Peter's Reserve, just outside of Selkirk, meaning your family obviously didn't go to Peguis. First of all, why didn't they end up going to Peguis?
Well, actually, there were a number of families that stayed behind after the illegal surrender of 1913. There was about 90 families that refused to leave. Well, my grandfather was one of them. He had been a farmer in that area. He owned an acreage of 90 acres on the reserve, and he farmed it, and he wanted to stay there. He liked the area, plus he was a fisherman, and the relocation, the place where the St. Peter's people were sent up to what is now Peguis, was no agricultural benefits, and the fishing was unknown and proved to be not as good as it was down in the southern end of the lake where St. Peter's was located. The question of the legality of the surrender was referred to the what we would now call the Federal Court of Canada. The Federal Court of Canada ruled that it was an illegal surrender, and so the government reacted to that decision by issuing a law called the St. Peter's Reserve Act in 1916, basically saying that the illegal surrender would be legalized if everybody who purchased land in the area would pay an extra $1 per acre into a fund, and all of those First Nations people who stayed behind had to enfranchise. So my grandfather was one of them.
So obviously that must have helped shape your future life then, being enfranchised already.
Yes, it was one of the issues that we were confronted with early on, and that is the lack of status between myself and other members of my family who did live in the Peguis area, and so the question of how that all came about was one that we were informed about early on. But it actually wasn't an issue very much. I did a paper one time on the benefits and burdens of the Indian Act, and whether being a member of a First Nation and having status under the Indian Act was actually a benefit or not. And my conclusion then was that it provided no benefit whatsoever. There were no educational programs off reserve. There was no funding for post-secondary students. There were no services provided off reserve, and any services provided on reserve were inadequate. And the provincial government services were much better. But it did clearly address and cause us to lose our sense of culture and identity.
I'm going to turn, I guess, to your career as a lawyer. One of your first cases, the judge mistook you for the defendant and asked you what you were charged with. That must have really hit home for you how Indigenous people were treated in the justice system.
While I was in law school, I became really quite enamored with the law and how the law worked, and I saw its weaknesses. I particularly saw the fact that it was used as a weapon of colonialism for many years, and I also saw that many of our people, Indigenous people, were being victimized in the system because they didn't have proper representation of people who understood them. And so, plus I loved being in court. I just loved arguing with people. And so I went to court a lot when I was in law school. I enrolled in the courses that took me to court. And then when I got out, I practiced law for a while and thought, I'll do this before I get into politics. So that led to a career as a lawyer for about 8 years, and then led to a career on the bench for 30 years.
Is that what sidetracked you from politics, was your career on the bench?
Very much so, yeah. It was, but you know,
But you were offered a judgeship twice, not once but twice, and you turned it down.
Oh, 3 times actually. Third time I did accept. The first 2 times, I didn't really want to be a judge. I saw it as a sort of like a dead-end job, in the sense that you went to the bench and you didn't really do anything after that, and you had limitations upon your freedom to speak, your limitations upon your freedom to associate with people in the community, and you know, plus, quite frankly, most of the people on the bench were old white guys, and not the kind of crowd that I was used to hanging out with. You know, Indigenous leaders, Phil Fontaine, Elijah Harper, Eric Robinson, basically took me out to dinner and said, you have to do it, because we need someone to get in that doorway and open the door for other people. So I said, well, I'll do it for 3 years. And then I was sworn in as a judge on March the 5th of 1988, and on March the 7th of 1988, J.J. Harper was shot. And everything changed.
Of course, and to remind our viewers, J.J. Harper was shot by Winnipeg police. Within 48 hours, the shooter was exonerated by the police. And that, of course, with his death and the death of Helen Betty Osborne, led to the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry, which you, of course, ended up co-commissioner of. So what were your expectations heading into that 3-year process?
Well, in a way, I saw it as an opportunity to take the issues of the relationship between Indigenous people and the City of Winnipeg Police in particular, but the justice system generally, and bring that to the public fore, and to give Indigenous people an opportunity to speak about their concerns with the way the legal system was working, and also to do a general review of how the law in its historical context had been used by governments and others to limit the rights of Indigenous people, not just their legal rights as Indigenous people, but their basic human rights, the right to vote, the right to wear their cultural costumes, cultural garb, the right to participate in ceremonies, the right to do their traditional ceremonies as well. I set out to do what I can to make the system understand what it was doing and how it should change.
Of course, there's a bunch of recommendations out of it. I know in the conclusion, there's a quote by an elder. His name's Rufus Prince, and I'm just going to quote him. And he talked about implementing the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry. You've got to do this or we're going to suffer repercussions, and the bureaucrats are going to find a nice high shelf for your report and recommendation, and a generation later, if they have another commission on the same subject, they'll find it there covered with dust. Of course, we're a generation later. Have the recommendations in that report gathered dust, in your opinion?
In our report, the AGI report, we talked about the need for an implementation process, and we made recommendations around an implementation process. And we targeted specific areas that we said really needed to be focused, such as addressing the way Indigenous people within the correction system, within the child welfare system, and by the police needed to be changed, and that somebody needed to monitor that too, and then to report on it publicly, to say this is happening, this is not happening. The one thing that we didn't do then that we did do following the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, was we didn't count upon the public reaction to the report, and we didn't try to harness that public reaction and to talk about the importance that the public was going to have in change. And I would say that to the extent that the report's recommendations, the AGI report's recommendations, have made their way into solid policy and law, it's because the public has demanded it. The public has said we need to have these changes.
But ultimately, I mean, people would argue that things have gotten worse. I mean, some of the figures they talked about, especially the overrepresentation of Indigenous people in prison back then, are even worse today.
Oh, absolutely, and the child welfare rates are even higher than they were before. A couple of reasons for that is because the way in which they've been implemented have been to, in fact, enhance the authorities of governments who don't know what they're doing. And in addition to that, populations have changed. We are the fastest growing population in Canada, still are. And so when you have a vulnerable population like that, plus population growing up in poverty, growing up in circumstances where their social connections are not strong, plus they feel disconnected from the educational system, you're going to have a disenfranchised group of people who are going to become more and more vulnerable to these processes. And so that's occurred. And in fact, we did predict that if we didn't do things effectively, that the numbers were going to get higher. My concern then, as it is today, is that that energy from that group of disenfranchised youth could easily become a violent energy, and it has to a certain extent. There's a social philosopher by the name of Frantz Fanon who wrote in 1948 that when you have a colonized people who have been oppressed by one society, first of all, they tend to submit to the colonization oppression. But then, when they start to recognize what they're experiencing, they will resist. But when that resistance is quashed, then they will start to take out their frustrations upon themselves, so the high rates of personal abuse grow. Secondly, they'll take it out upon those around them, so violence against family members, against neighbors, against people in their community will grow, but eventually they'll take out their violence on the oppressor. So then you'll have rebellion. And so my view is that if we continue to ignore what society is doing to Indigenous people in terms of the poverty, the education failure rates, and I'm not talking about the individuals who are failing, I'm talking about the educational system that's failing, and the child welfare rates, we will likely be creating a population of young Indigenous people who will be prone to thinking about acting out violently against society.
Well, on that note, we need to take a break, but we'll be back after a short break with more from Senator Murray Sinclair. Welcome back. Here now is part 2 of my sit-down interview with Senator Murray Sinclair. Okay, Senator Sinclair, before the break you briefly mentioned the TRC, which is probably something you're going to be most remembered for. And when you were first approached to be a commissioner, you turned it down. Why was that?
Well, I had done an intervening inquiry, and that was into the deaths of 12 babies at the Health Science Center. And it took an emotional toll on me to listen to evidence about how babies died, particularly when I concluded that 9 out of the 14, or a number of them, didn't have to die, that if they had been handled properly, they would have been alive. But when the first set of commissioners couldn't get along and stepped down, then I was called again, and by that time, in addition to that, I was aware of the reaction of the survivors and the real disappointment they felt and their sense of victimization again at that. And I thought, well, I'd always told students when I lectured at law schools that our obligation is this: if you can, you must. And so I took up my own challenge. I could, so I did.
And you, of course, were there for several years. What got you through that? Because I know it must have been difficult at times.
It was, again, an emotionally very demanding process, but I was better prepared for it because of the experience of the AJI and the baby death inquiry. This time I instructed the commissioners and the staff to ensure that we had proper supports in place. So we had spiritual supports for each of the commissioners, for each of the senior staff, and for all of the staff, and that we had cultural supports for those who we required or wished to have the access to elders and ceremonies, all of the survivors who were doing that at the end of every day invited us to join them. And so we sat in a healing circle with them at the end of each day. And they insisted that we had to, at the end of each day, that we also had to participate in those kinds of recovery processes because they could see the burden that it was having on us. You know, we listened to them, we showed them our respect, our concern, and we believed them, and they, in turn, took care of us. So that was important.
Of course, at the end of it, there were more recommendations. They were called calls to action, of course. And the first 5 concerned child welfare. How deliberate was it to put those at the front?
Actually, the first 25 or so calls to action are really aimed at the immediate problems. So the changes necessitated by what's going on in the child welfare system were front and center, as were the changes required to address the health issues of Indigenous people, the incarceration rates of Indigenous people, and the substandard housing, substandard living conditions that Indigenous people were facing. They're all at the front end because what we said is it's hard for you to talk about the big questions of life when it's those little questions of survival that you really have to struggle with every day. And sometimes they take up incredible amounts of energy and prevent you from getting to those really big questions. So we said these things have to be addressed so that people will be able to look at the larger questions down the road, and that is, you know, things like how do we change the relationship with government? It's hard to talk about that question when you're fighting a social system where your grandchild is being taken away that very morning, and you're spending the next 3 or 4 years fighting to get your grandchild back. And that's what's important to you at that time. And so we said that needs to be fixed first.
Bill C-92, the reform of child welfare, appears to be the result of call to action number 4. But what's the biggest problem you see so far with that bill?
Well, there's lots of problems with the bill. It's not anywhere near what we had written about as necessitated by the experience that Indigenous people are having with the child welfare system. It doesn't address adequately the question of provincial jurisdiction. It doesn't deal well with the question of funding for Indigenous agencies. The Human Rights Tribunal decisions are still not being implemented and are not going to come any close to being implemented by this particular bill. So it has a lot of weaknesses. But the one thing that it does have that people must not lose sight of is that it clearly recognizes jurisdictional rights of Indigenous communities, Indigenous people, to making all of the child welfare decisions for themselves. And so if Indigenous communities find themselves in a position where without government support, without government involvement, they can exercise their right to deal with child welfare issues in their communities or for their members.
There's a huge effort on right now to get it passed. This week alone, it's in the House and Senate committees being studied and pre-studied. I guess what's your gut feeling? Is this one going to be one that actually gets royal assent?
Well, I don't know the answer to that. Some days I wonder if we're going to get anything done in this Senate at this time. But the bill actually hasn't reached the Senate yet. We did a pre-study of it through the Aboriginal Peoples Committee, and the pre-study identified a number of weaknesses in the bill, and the minister's team in the House has indicated that they will look at the report from the Aboriginal Peoples Committee and to identify those areas that they feel they might be able to address. I know that 2 areas that were identified as being very major concerns for the committee were the area of funding and the question of provincial jurisdiction. And so whether the federal government is prepared to put amendments in place before it gets to the Senate so that we don't have to amend it in the Senate and then send it back and get into that back and forth action remains to be seen. But The reality is that the Senate has a role to play here, and so if we don't like it, we can amend it and send it back, and then they have to decide whether they accept it. And if they don't want to accept it, then they send it back, and so we keep doing that. And theoretically, we could.
Of course, we're running out of time to do that now.
Yeah, but you know, I keep telling people we have until the middle of October, so let's not be so shy about that. No, nobody wants to stay here over the summertime, but if it's important enough, then we'll do what we need to do. And the same is true for the Indigenous Languages Bill. It has the similar kinds of weaknesses.
Of course, you do a lot more than work just as a senator. You led a review of the Thunder Bay Police Services Board, calling for its complete overhaul. Why did you agree to do that review?
It was a moment of foolishness, I think. And I only say that partly facetiously because I thought I would have the time to do it. But it was an important public responsibility, and I was asked by the Ontario government to take it on. And having had some experience working with people from Thunder Bay, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, I knew that the question of policing in that area was a really serious issue. And I had good staff to work with me on it. And so when we undertook the review, we identified throughout the process the major issues that we felt needed to be taken care of. And when I issued my reports last year, I was pleased to see that they acted very quickly on them. Immediately suspended the board and put in place a new commissioner. So, so I think they've started the process of change. That's really important.
Finally, you became a senator just a few years ago. You talked about you'd wish you could get more done, but is there something that you feel you have gotten accomplished in that short time?
I do have this sense that my mere presence changes the way people think and talk about things. Certainly the way they talk about things, I think, is changed. And I'm not one to shy away from opportunities to remind them when they say and do things that ignore the rights of Indigenous people or ignore the fact that this is going to have a negative impact upon the Indigenous community, or to tell them that we need to do more than what we're now doing when it comes to the vulnerable Indigenous community, which has been put in that position by past government legislation, including former acts of the Senate. And so I said the Senate has a role to play in reconciliation as well, and they need to accept that. And so having said that, now I'm giving some direction, I think, to helping them understand how to make that happen.
Well, I wish we could talk more. It's been fascinating to talk to you. Senator Sinclair, thank you for speaking to me.
Well, thank you very much, Todd.
We'll have more after another short break. Welcome back. Thanks for watching our feature interview with Senator Murray Sinclair. We're taking a week off, but we'll be back in 2 weeks to hear our political panel of MPs debate the issues of the day. I'm Todd Lamarand. Have a great evening.